So welcome everybody. So the prereq for this class was to either have been in the previous class or to have watched the video of that class, which is available free online. If you weren't able to do that, it's going to be a little bit of a handicap because we're going to start in without too much review, but I'll give you a little bit of review in case there's somebody who is just coming in. You're certainly welcome to stay and learn. But you'll want to go back and see that because I'm going to lean heavily on that material that we did, where we went through how to do a narrative analysis of, we took the calming the storm story and did that. What I'd like you to have available for you is at least, during this class, is at least a piece of paper and a pen or pencil. That's the minimum. You have to have something because we're going to be doing, I'm going to have you writing some things down. So get that now if you don't have something like that. There also was a handout that was kind of a piece of glorified scratch paper here that I had that had the diagram, the graphic that we used to represent our work from last time. So I'll be referring to that and it'll be in my slides. So before we get started here, now in this area of the world, we've had some interesting weather lately. In fact, really a bad enough storm that we had major flooding. There's one local high school that is shut down, not because of coronavirus, but because it flooded, an in-town high school that flooded because there was so much rain. So as we get started here, I want you to think about what is the most memorable storm that you've been through. Let me tell you what I think of with that. So when my third son, Daniel, was a senior in high school, we went on a backwoods canoe trip to Boundary Waters. This is between Canada and the United States. It's just wilderness. There's no development. There's nothing out there. There's no cell phone towers. There's no GPS. There's nothing developed. It's just wilderness. And we went out with a few other high school kids, a couple other adults, and we went out in canoes and just did backcountry camping. We had a great week of doing that. And as we were done, we were ready to canoe on out, and we had, a good, more than a day of canoeing to get out of the backcountry. And as we were going along, it started to rain. And we went along a little farther. We were coming to a lake, and you had to go in between the lakes and find the places that connected the lakes in the wilderness. And we were looking for this, and it started to rain, and then the winds whipped up, and the waves got high enough that we were getting kind of nervous that the canoes were going to tip. So we moved our canoes over towards shore and traveled to shore where the waves were a little bit less high, and kept looking for this place where we were supposed to connect to the next lake to get out. And the wind got heavier, and the temperature started dropping, and it was cold, and we were just in this driving rain and trying to keep our canoes from tipping. And as we were going along with this, all of a sudden lightning came down and struck right in the water in the lake right in front of us. And it was at that time that I thought of this story, Calming the Storm, because my thought was, don't you care that we're about to die? So it's just, we had to get off the storm, and there's a whole nother part of the story. Obviously we made it because I'm still here, but that was the most memorable storm for me. But that's what I think of as when I was going through that, I was thinking about the story, Calming the Storm, that we looked at, and how the disciples felt when they were in the middle of this storm. What I'd like to do here is, I want you to think about what your story is, but I'm not going to share that right now. We're going to hold that for a little bit later. Let's go back. This is where we landed last week. We took the story, Calming the Storm, off the page, and we used this sketch, this rough sketch of the different placeholders, the things that were mentioned in the story, to get that described scene in our minds as kind of a small movie in our minds, so that we were seeing actually the action that was going on. And then we moved that movie out of our minds into the room around us, so that we were really in the scene and imagining being in the scene as we read the story again and thought about it. And that's a standard narrative analysis technique to help you understand what was really going on in the story. Some people do that naturally. For those of us that don't, this was a technique that helped us to do that, but I also was using the technique to come up with key points to do a lesson plan, which is what we're going to do today. So just to remind you what this seed represents here, the story in Mark 4 is at the end of the day, after Jesus has done a lot of teaching. Like the kingdom parables were what he was teaching that day. And as he's done, the crowd started to disperse, and Jesus said, let's go to the other side of the lake. And so they took Jesus and they put him in a boat, and they headed off. And several other boats followed him. And Jesus went in the back of the boat and laid down with his head on a cushion and fell asleep. And then this huge storm came up, and the waves started crashing over the boat and filling it up. And the disciples became so fearful. They went and woke up Jesus and they said, Master, don't you care that we're about to die? And Jesus got up and he said, peace, be still. And the wind stopped and the sea became calm. And he looked at the disciples and he said, where is your faith? Why were you so afraid? And the disciples looked at him and said to each other, what kind of a man is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? And then they headed off to the other side of the lake. Now that's a great story. It's not a long story, but it's a great story. I want you to think, what is your favorite part of that story? What is your favorite part to that story? What would you say? And what does that story teach you about people? The crowds, the disciples, the people that got on the other boat. Mainly the disciples are the focus of this, but what does this story teach you about people? And the center of the story is Jesus. What does that story teach you about Jesus? Now, all I've done right there is I've outlined for you a narrative Bible teaching lesson. It took, 3 minutes? Now, I didn't engage the class unless you let you answer those things this time because I was using it as an example. But what I wanted to show you is that is what narrative Bible teaching is. We took a story from Scripture and I presented it in a way that you could see it happening in your mind. And then we engaged the story with simple questions. What's your favorite part? That's a kind of introductory question that's real easy. The standard question set after that is, what does it teach you about people and what does it teach you about God? Is a standard missionary narrative Bible teaching practice that's being used around the world right now. And it doesn't take very long, and it's something that everybody can do because all of you can take that story, picture it in your minds, do a conversational summary of the story. I did. I'm not a professional storyteller, never pretended to be, don't want to be, but I can do a conversational retelling of a story in a way that's good enough so that you can picture it. And then we can ask simple questions that engage you. And so you can do a complete narrative Bible teaching lesson that quickly. In fact, you can even do it faster than that. I didn't even have that much time for probably the most common place that I've done narrative Bible teaching is when I started doing the Wednesday night boys program at our church. I told one Bible story per night for 17 years at our church. From the time my oldest son was in second grade till my youngest son went out of the program. And so I only had a little bit of time at the end of the night. We had a lot of other activities. They were good things. Kids really cared about dodgeball, but we wanted to give them some Bible teaching. And so I would tell them like that, one story a night. And I didn't even have time to ask them questions, but they knew that they had enough time that they could ask questions of me if they wanted to. So all I would do is finish telling the story and say, if we had time, I said, do we have any questions? And the hands would shoot up and we would go. So I want to give you 4 different lesson plans of increasing length that you can do narrative Bible teaching with this kind of narrative analysis at the core. The first is just tell the story and say, any questions? That's the one I've done the most of, and it works great. Out of that question and answer, I had first graders who understood, or were asking adult level theology questions and giving adult level theology answers. I have great stories if we have time to tell you about that. It was just amazing to me how they connected and understood what it was there. The second level is to go a little bit, to ask more questions. That's the, what's your favorite part of the story? What does the story teach you about people? What does the story teach you about God? That's your second level, just a little bit longer, a little bit more in depth, a little bit more active. Now, the third level, where you do a narrative retelling of the story with the group. So if I had time with these young kids, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll say, okay, I've told you the story. Now let's go back through the story. Who wants to be part of the crowd? Who wants to be the disciples? Who wants to be Jesus? And we'll go through and we'll put them in that hologram that we talked about in our mind. They'll become that. They'll become those. And we'll just walk through and they'll be the placeholders to represent it. And as we walk through the story and I retell the story, I do it in a way that's like, what happened next? That's the first thing. So I'll just start the story and then I'll say, then what happened? And the kids retell the story. It's more active. And then as I go through the story and keep asking them what happened next, then, and I've done this with adults as well, it works just as well with adults. By the way, whatever you use to teach your third graders works even better for adults. Just don't tell them it's for third graders, but it works just great. I've taught so many classes at my church that were originated in third grade, and the adults never knew that I didn't change a thing in the curriculum. I just made it an adult class, and we had that. So it's the what happened next questions is how you do the retelling with that group as they walk through it. And then there's 3 levels of questions that I use. I call them see, wonder, think. Just a little bit more in depth than the what's your favorite, what does it teach about people, what does it teach about God. So after asking them what happens next in the story, the concrete questions, then I ask them what they see. So I want to know details about the story that they may be missing out. Like, what time of day was it again now? I want them to see that it was the evening. Now, you know, how, and then I'll do, the next question is wonder questions, where I wonder how many boats took off after Jesus. It doesn't say, but it's a great question to ask them. How many boats took off? I'm wondering how many boats took off. What do you guys think? And we have a discussion about that. Where exactly was Jesus sleeping? It doesn't really say. Was he getting wet during the storm? It doesn't say, but those are I wonder questions. And then the final more in-depth question is, what were they thinking? It's the see, wonder, think. What do you think the disciples were thinking? Do you think they really thought they were going to die? A lot of these guys were fishermen. And so you can do that. So that's your third level. So I'm giving you super short, just tell the story, ask if there's any questions. Second level, tell the story and go through the what's your favorite? What do you think about, what does this teach you about people, about God? That's a second level. And the third level is the group retelling of the story using the what happened next and then the see, wonder, and think questions. So basically I'm going from lighter questions to heavier questions as I go through and they retell the story. So the fourth one is what is a lot longer. And I'm going to spend my time on the fourth presentation here. And this is, so if you want to have a longer session than these, or if you want to go into more depth or do more active learning, more options for teaching, then I'm going to go through a narrative Bible teaching process that gives you more options. Now, 4 lesson plan that you could do with any story: super short, short, medium, and now we'll spend the last time on, it can be longer, doesn't have to be, but I'll show you how to go through that. So what I want you to do first, though, is think of who you would want to teach this lesson to, this Calming the Storm story. I want you to pick somebody in your life that either you are going to teach this to or you would potentially teach it to. Because I think it's really important to have your audience in mind, at least at the end when we have to put things together. There's a lot of preparation that is common to whoever you're telling this to, but at the end, it'll make a difference who you're presenting to. Because I do teach, even though I joked about doing the same lesson for 3rd graders as adults, that may have some truth to it, but there is some modifications, of course. That makes sense. So right now in your mind, pick your audience, and I want you to write that audience down that you're thinking of on your scratch paper. So that's the first thing you're going to write on your scratch paper, is who you are thinking of as we go through to do a lesson prep today. So go ahead and do that real quick. And I don't mind if you change and use a different one, but just for today's practice, I want you to be thinking of a particular group or person that you're going to share this with. Okay, so we're going to take this sketch and attach it to the process we did last time, where we looked at the story and thought about its main points, the key points in the story. We thought of, and those are the ones in red, and we thought of those as, we had several responses people thought were the key points. They were either Master, don't you care that we're about to die, or Peace be still, or Where is your faith? Why were you so afraid? So one of those is the center of the story, was the key parts of the narrative analysis of the peaks of that story. The blue circles on the scratch paper here indicate the unique characteristics of the story, that there was a storm, there was a boat, there was a lake. And those are the unique, not in-depth theological parts of the story, but the key surface characteristics of the story that set it apart. And then we went through our narrative outline and looked at the different perspectives of the people that were in the story. The crowd, the people that took off in the boats, the disciples before the storm, and the disciples after the storm. So that was where we were going to draw our teaching points from, and that's what we'll do today. Okay, let's dive in and kind of give you a process. What I want you to do right now then is also take your pencil or pen out, and I want you to write these letters on the left side of your page. P-O-S-E-S, poses. This is the acronym that we will use. So write that there. And it's just our organizational method for coming up with a way of organizing our thoughts. And here's what these things stand for. You don't have to write these in because we're going to go over all of these. So keep the shorthand, but purpose, opening, story, explore, and summary. Those are the steps we're going to go through in doing narrative lesson prep. Okay, so let's talk about what we did in the first 3. What I did is I took this longer process and I just focused on the main parts of the lesson, which were the story itself, how it was presented, and a simple way to explore the story. So in our first 3 examples, the very short, the short, and the little bit long, the medium, we just focused on the story, and I used narrative conversational telling of the story, and then different levels of story of discussion questions in those. And now, so I wanted you to see where those first 3 fit in, because they all fit into the same framework. But now let's look at the longer process, and we'll start with first, purpose. Now, the focal points of the story, the key parts that are circled in red there, are the focus of the story. The purpose is, what is going to be the purpose of your lesson? What is it you want to get across in your lesson. Now, this may change as you do your preparation, but I really like to do this first because I know the story well enough and I know my audience that I just have an idea from what I know at the beginning of what it is I want to accomplish. And I think if you're purpose-driven as a teacher, it really helps you in the way you navigate our preparation here. So what I want you to do first here is know from what you know about the story already and what you know about the audience that you wrote down, what is it that you would want to accomplish in the lesson once we're done? So I want you to write that down right now, is what do you want to accomplish? And then if you don't mind, if some of you would, once you get done, if you would type it in the chat box, I'd like to kind of see what you're writing there again. If you're going to teach this lesson to the audience you've chosen, what is it you want to get across? What is the main point you want to get across to them?
We have assurance from Jesus' presence, purpose, and power. The person I'm telling realizes Jesus has all power. Students will trust Jesus in difficult situations to show that Jesus is in control and we can rely on him to calm the storm. Peace in troubled times. Increased faith in storms.
Okay, great. Okay, so we've got a purpose. So we've accomplished number one. Now what we're going to do is we're going to, let me just talk to you as you've done that. I want to kind of, now that you've picked it, we can maybe refine it, but you want to take the key, what we've done is we've taken the key points of the story and decided on the purpose of the lesson, and we're going to use that purpose to guide our choices of how to craft each component of the lesson. Now we're going to go on to the opening of the story. Now, the opening of the story is something I like to do, especially in longer classes, because it just makes it fun. It's just you're engaging. It's what draws people into the lesson. People don't like to be bored. They may be interested in the Bible, but they really don't. It just helps if you make it easy. So this is what this is. The principles that we're going to do with an opening as we craft it is that it's more important for the opening to be fun and interesting than it is for it to be profound. Sometimes us Bible teachers, we want to be profound all the time. You don't need to be profound in this one. This is a time to be light. People are drawn to light. That's what brings them in. Then they're going to be willing to be profound. It is less important that the opening ties into the purpose of the lesson, but if you can do so, that's fine. It's nice, but it doesn't even have to tie into the purpose. So even though we've done the purpose first, to the opening, it's less important. The opening can be very tangential to the story, but it should be somewhat at least associated with the passage. I have seen classes where they just do an opening with a funny YouTube video, and everybody has fun with that, and it's engaging, and it's like it. But it's then to switch into the Bible story, it almost feels like you've left that and now you're not going to do what's fun. You're going to make that. It's not a natural break. You want it to correlate and have some kind of relationship. And because of that, you want to be able to craft a transition from your opening to get to the teaching part of your lesson. And so those are the principles in creating an opening. And here's some examples of type of things that I use for openings. I use personal stories. Hey, where have you heard that before? You ever heard of a story of a lake or a storm on a lake or a storm in a boat on a lake recently? Well, I just started off with the opening that I would use to teach this story. Sometimes I use games. And I have games and quizzes separate here, but as I thought about it, I'm not sure they're really different. Most of my games are quiz games. And so when I first made this out, I was thinking of a game that really wasn't a quiz, so I separated them out. And they can be different, but most of the things that I found that are useful and helpful are little quiz games that the class likes to do. And then the third one that I've found really to be helpful is personal characteristics related to a theme. Now, as part of the church is all shutting down with COVID here lately. I told you last time I have lots of kids. We have 5 different households of kids that live in town, and they don't all go to the same church, so all their churches were closed. So rather than each of us doing our own separate Zoom church, we decided to get together and just Zoom just our family, because we've used these personal characteristics related to a theme as openers, and it has been just a riot because you're learning all sorts about your own family, things you'd ever, especially the daughters-in-law that we have, and it's just been really nice. So it's really an icebreaker type time. It's a time to get to know each other, but it's going to relate to the story. Personal characteristics are things like, okay, let's go with what we did last week. We were talking about the disciples going off on their first journeys that Jesus sent them without anything but a walking stick and their sandals. They had no money or anything. So I said, tell me what kind of a packer you are for a trip. Are you the kind, on a 0 to 10 scale, are you a 0 where you like to pack at the last minute? You don't even start packing until the car is going out of the driveway? Or are you a 10 where you like to pack weeks ahead of time and have everything ready? And so everybody gave their number, and it was just an interesting personal characteristic related to the theme of how we like to go off on a trip. That's a personal characteristic related to a theme that was tangentially related to that story. So what I'd like to do now is going to stretch you a little bit. But I'd like you to try this. I'd like you to try and think of an opening that you would use with your group to teach the Call Me in the Storm story that would be fun or interesting and would either be a personal story like I've already given you an example of, and then gave you guys the option. If we would have been in a class, I would have listened to all your storm stories and we would have had fun listening to all those things. That's a great way to start, and that works. Or if you want to do a game or a quiz game related to boats or lakes or storms, or sometimes you can get into heavier things. Sometimes I've tried things like, have you ever had a time where you thought you were going to die? That's not real light though, but it's interesting. And then personal characteristics related to a theme are more things like, when did you learn, how old were you when you learned to swim? Or how many of you get seasick? There's different things like that, and I'll show you some other ones. I'm going to give you a collection after this. But I'd like you to try and just brainstorm right now what kind of interesting, tangentially related opening you would use with your group. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to do it. And then Roger's going to break us into breakouts of 4 each, and you'll have 2 minutes to just share what you did. Now, if you can't think of one, that's okay. Then what I want you just to share with the group is who is your audience, and maybe they can help you come up with something like that. But this is not an end product. I just want you to start getting a feel for what it's like to think of an interesting opening like this. So why don't we give 2 minutes, Roger, to think about this on your own, and then we'll break them out for 2 minutes to share with the group of 4. Is that okay?
Very good. I'll send them into rooms. Mark, you're going to be in a room as well.
Okay.
And I'll close them after 2 minutes.
Very good. Okay, we have 2 minutes to do that. All right. You know what? I hope that worked for everybody. We were in the middle of a great story that we're going to have to find out what happens later. But it just shows you that it's just interesting to hear what people's experiences are. And so I think that is, as you just come up with simple experiences related to the story, other people start thinking of their interesting experiences. And it's a great time to get to know people. It's a great time to start relating to the themes of the story. So first is personal stories, and 2 of the people at our group had personal stories about storms. And they're just interesting to listen to. It stimulates other ones, and I think we've already seen that that works. That's how I opened this class, and I find it to be really helpful. The downside of personal stories is they're often, if you have a big group, you don't have enough time, they can get too long. It's hard to know where to rein it in because everybody's got an interesting story. And some of the stories, are really fun to tell and don't pay attention to time limits. So personal stories is a great one. If you've got time and you want to get to know your class better, they're really going to love that and connect with it. It's a great opening. Another is the games idea. And I use this every once in a while when I want to have a little bit more control of time. And so here's an example. I'm going to give you 5 pictures that are a series. They're related in a series. And you have to tell me what the 5th picture is. Now, this was planned for an audience that I knew would know this. So but it wouldn't work for all your audiences. So that's why we have to pick an audience. So I'm going to give you the 4, and you tell me what the 5th one is. See if anybody can do this. Here's the first picture. Here's the second picture. Here's the third picture. Here's the 4th picture. Does anybody know what the 5th picture should be? Nobody? Okay, well, let me give you a little hint here. What if I told you that these are raindrops on roses, whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles, warm woolen mittens? Now, does anybody know what the last picture is?
This is Sound of Music.
Sound of Music, yes. These are my favorite things.
Right. This is brown paper packages tied up with strings. So if you've seen the movie Sound of Music, and some of us have a long time ago, but there's a song in there that has these lines in it. And remember when they sang this song? They sang it when the kids were afraid of a storm. And this song was how you think through your anxiety during a storm. And so it's tangentially related. It was kind of fun. If you know the movie and the music, it was kind of fun, but it kind of was a good way to do that. So that's an example of a game that you can put together that people enjoy trying to figure out. It just makes it fun. Now, the personal characteristics related to a theme, that's one that one of our group talked about, and that may be, that one's really been helpful for my family. We've enjoyed this, but the one example that was given in our group was on a 0 to 10 scale, how do you react to storms? 0 is I'm really anxious and I run downstairs or I stay out of it, to 10 is I'm bold and fearless and I go out on the porch to see if I can see the tornado coming at us. And so people are along those lines. So, but those are great things for people to go around. It's a little bit shorter than the personal stories, but it has the same effect of people sharing something about themselves that they find is enjoyable. Just make sure that you pick something that's not embarrassing for people or hard for them to do. Again, keep it light, keep it interesting. But that one would definitely work for this story. And then quizzes. I usually think of this a little bit different than that solving game. This is more, if you've ever played Sporkle. Have anybody heard of the name Sporkle? It's an online game that you can play that as a group you try and come up and see how many different things that you can list from in a category. So like just last week, my kids did one on MVPs of the NBA in the last 20 years. They went through and did that. So that would be one. For this one, you might do, movies that have storms in them and have people start doing that. We have a lot of fun with that. So that's an example of that type of a game. So those are some ideas for opening. So that's your first part, and you've tried it, and I think you have an idea of how to do it. why don't you go ahead and make sure that on your O part, you've written down your purpose. Now write down maybe a couple options now that you've heard some that would work for your group. So go ahead and write those down in the O. So you've got a couple, you don't have to choose one, but the ones you thought, yeah, that would work for my group, write down a couple thoughts there so that you don't forget that. Okay, so let's go on to the presentation of the story. So here's the principles for presenting the story. Reading the passage is usually only partially effective by itself. I like to read the passage myself, or at least a portion of the passage. I think it honors the text, and I think it centers people, lets them know that the story that you're teaching is from the scripture. I think it also kind of just validates a little bit what you're doing culturally. You got to depend on where you're at culturally with that. But I know in where I live, reading the text is an important cultural step to do. And when I don't do that, people miss that. But just to read the text by itself, it tends to be very difficult for people sitting in a group to listen to a read text and be able to picture what's going on. That's unique to maybe our times, but it's certainly true, and people have trouble doing with it. If you feel like you really want to read the text, there's two settings where people can really listen well. One is when the kids are going to bed and there's nothing else there. Reading the text really works for that group because their minds are focused on what we're being read to. The other is just go ahead and have the group close their eyes if they can do that, because closing your eyes helps focus your listening. So that really helps. But if you're going to read, make sure you practice reading, read the passage slowly, use a clear translation that people that feel is conversational really helps, or use more than one. Usually I start with reading, but then I repeat the story with a different presentation. Getting the class or the group to retell the story is especially fun and effective, but in our longer story presentation, I'll usually read the passage or a part of the passage, then I'll have a different way of retelling the story from this group and go from there. But telling the story in your own words is absolutely attention holding, and that's why the name of our organization is Christian Storytelling and Bible Telling, is because we've found that this conversational retelling of the story accurately really connects with people, and they find it's almost unforgettable. And that's why I used this technique when I would have only 10 minutes with grade school age boys to impart the scriptures to them. They got it. I would tell them the story, and when I would come back, I would use my first part to ask them what happened last week. A lot of them could remember last week's story. I didn't have to retell the story or remind them about it. They were right there. They knew exactly what was coming next, because I usually used the technique as I would tell a story, and then I would start telling the next one, and then I would stop and say, oh, wait, I don't have enough time to tell that one. You'll have to come back next week. So I use that hook. So they were always anticipating what was going on. And I would get a big groan, but they would definitely be listening because they would know what it is. And because of that, they would know what the next story was. This class has not gone over storytelling techniques, although everything we've done to prepare the lesson is the same way I learned to tell the story. We do everything we just did to prepare the lesson, and then I just start reading and telling, and you tell it to 5 people, or you tell it over and over again, and you just have to practice it. But once you can see the story in your mind, you can tell it, and it's just a matter of practice until you can tell it smoothly. So I would encourage you, if you're not doing that already, is to go ahead with that skill. But anybody that's not done that, I would really encourage you to do that. Then the next is to have the class retell the story to each other in different levels of detail. Now, this is a fun one. This is not the group retelling where you stand around and talk about it. This is where you say, okay, I want you to turn to your partner and I want you to tell them what happened in this story in 2 sentences. And they have to condense it down to 2 sentences. And but they really, what it makes them do is it makes them integrate and think what's important in the story and do that. Or maybe I'll tell them that they have 20 seconds, or I'll just give them something where they have to retell the story. And then maybe I'll go back and say, now turn to the partner and tell as much as you can remember about it. And without any practice of storytelling, people that are loose can just do a perfect job of it. They don't need to do all this preparation, because if you listen to a told story and then you're just free to tell it conversationally, it just flows. It just happens. And so this is another way of retelling the story that I think really is effective, and I have used this before. And then the final one is the one that I used previously, which is walk through a retelling of the story and having the class represent the characters. And sometimes I do this interspersing it with questions that we talked about. Sometimes I just walk through and I just do the retelling of the story because of time. I maybe won't do the questions, or if I have some other exploration that I want to do. So here are some options that you have for creating the picture of the story in the minds of your class or group. What I want you to do is I want you to go down to the S part of your sheet, your diagram, and I want you to write what's your plan for presenting the story to your group. How do you want to do that to your group? So go ahead and write that down. Okay, let's move on to the narrative Bible teaching. And this is the explore part. And this is where there's just a lot of variability in what you can do. But I'll just tell you, if you're purpose-driven and you've had an interesting, fun opening for the class, and you've presented the story in a way that they've listened to, because these are good stories, then the exploration step, it's just going to happen whether you have control of it or not. It's just going to happen because they're going to be engaged, relaxed, and thinking about an important story. And so it does help to have a little structure to guide them with. But like I said, with the young kids, if they're going to still just have questions and want to talk about things, then it's just going to go. So let's look at the different options that we have for exploring the story, at least some. Let's talk about the principles of exploration. As we explore a story, you want to move from concrete observations then onto inferred details, and then to the thoughts and motivations of the characters. This is the see, wonder, and think categories of questions. And then prefer active learning techniques over passive techniques. And this really makes such a huge difference in terms of what happens to the group. With passive techniques, you have more control but less engagement. With active techniques, you may lose control, but they will definitely be engaged with the story. Okay, let's talk about the options that we have of using exploration techniques. One is you can give a short sermon. Now, again, if you have controlled time, depending on what it is, you can just treat it as a devotional and you can share what you think about it. It's valid, it's time tested, it works, but is the least engaging, least active teaching thing you can do. So you just have to do a better job of it. You have to be a very engaging speaker, and it takes a lot more work, frankly, and it still tends to not engage as much as active learning does. But it's certainly a legitimate time to do this. I've already told you the very short one is ask the group if they have any questions, and you can just start there and see what happens. And that's very legitimate to start there, and maybe the group knows where they want to go with it. Maybe they've been thinking about things all along that's bothered them about this story that you never thought of. And so you can start here, and if it doesn't go anywhere, then go with your teaching techniques that you had planned on. but it might just take off from there. Now, but the one that's probably the most commonly used are discussion questions. Bible studies live on discussion and questions. We're going to talk about discussion questions a little bit. So the principles on discussion questions is we always want to move from lighter questions to heavier questions, unless your group is already light and ready to go. You don't have to do that, but most of the time the groups do better if you start lighter and then move to heavier. So we've talked about this. A safe but provocative question is, what did you like about this story? That one works great. Progress from concrete questions to inferred details. This is the see, wonder, and think progression. And then the last one is the one that's used commonly on the missionary field, which is what's the story teaches about people and what it teaches about God. Those are deeper questions, and if your group's ready for them, they're great questions. But I have found that sometimes if you just follow that method and go straight to those, it's just a little too deep for a group that is not confident in their opinions about it. So they're going to struggle with that a little bit more until, so that you have to know your group in terms of what's going on. Let's take a break here and have you write one question for your story, for your group, that you would use for a see, a think, a see and a wonder and a think question. The first question, see, is what did you see? So it's like something in the story that you want them to pay attention to. The wonder question is something that's inferred in the story but not stated there. So what do you wonder about in the story? And then the think question is what do you, question that gets them to explore what the thoughts of the characters in the story was. So what I'd like to do is take a minute or two and just write down one question for your group out of each of those categories. See, think, or just write see, wonder, think, and then write a question that you would work for your group if you were going to frame some discussion questions there. Okay, you can work, if you didn't get done with those, you can work on those, but I just want you to have some idea of good discussion questions that will work in progression with your group. Okay, thank you for doing that. The next is QAR activities, and these are question and response activities. So it's a little bit more in-depth than just asking discussion questions. And I'm going to tell you that this is the book that Phyllis wrote on storytelling and QR activities for the classroom. She also has a book that's written specifically for Bible stories. And she's running several workshops in August in relation to this. So let me just tell you a little bit what it is. I use these as well. I think they're really fun and helpful. They really come out of educational people with educational backgrounds, but they really can be used easily in non-school settings. Couple examples that I've used with my family during our time here, where we've been doing our own church services together as a family, which has been tremendously nice. We've always gotten together as a family, but to have time focused on discussing deeper issues as a group has just been so nice for our family. I mean, we're all going to go back to our churches when they open up, but you can tell everybody's like, wow, we're going to miss this. This has really been nice. But one of the QAR activities we did is something called an I am poem. We did the story about the woman who'd had 12 years of bleeding, and Jesus healed her while he was on the way to heal the young girl, Jairus' daughter, who had died at 12 years old. And so what we did is we took the constructs from this QR activity, and we just broke into groups, and we answered little questions. One said, I am, and so we'd like the woman. I am the woman that was healed. And then they would write things on their paper like, I see, and then they would write what they see. Or I think, and then they would write what the woman was thinking. And then they would say, I feel, and then do this. So there's like 14 different prompts that the family would break into groups. And then they'd take those and they put them together into a poem. And it was just a way of exploring that was fun for them. And when they were done, they had a very dynamic poem that sounded like it was written by the woman who had been healed by Jesus by using these prompts and doing this. So it was just a fun way of doing it. Another one that we've used is she calls freeze frame, or I call wax museum, where we take a scene from the story and break up into groups and with different scenes, and they have to figure out who everybody's going to be in the scene and what facial expressions and what they're doing, and then they come in and then we say freeze, and they all go into their things, and then everybody discusses. We take a picture of it and put it up on our TV, and then everybody discusses who it is, what each person is, and why they're thinking, what are they doing. But it's just a fun, interactive way to do that. So those are a couple ideas from the QAR activities book. But if you're interested in doing more in-depth activities like this, Phyllis has, I don't know, she's got a ton of them. Yeah, so you got a lot of options there. She has graphic organizers and other things. So this is a legitimate option as well that you can explore more if that's something you're interested in, would do good for your group. Roger, go ahead.
Back to the chat room. There's a question in the chat room about wonder and thinking questions. And that is, would this question be a wonder or a thinking question? Why did Jesus wait for the disciples to ask for help? Is that wonder or thinking?
I think that's, yeah, in my category, and I'm not sure that it really matters that much, but to me, the think questions are, what are people thinking? So I would put it in the think category. The wonder questions, I think of things that I wonder about what was in the story that I can't see, that the details weren't given.
Okay, and QAR stands for questions and response.
Question and response. The last one I have here is creative group activities. And so these type of activities are where you divide the class into groups and you say, I want you to write a poem on your own, or I want you to write a song, or I want you to do a pantomime or do a piece of art. So I tried this with some youth leaders that were wanted to learn about these activities. So I was teaching them how to do it. So I broke up them into groups. And so it was really fun. They did such a good job. So one was, they were assigned to be news reporters. And so they would go around, and part of their group would be the reporters, part would be the people that were there at the scene, and they would go and interview the people that had gotten into the boats, or interview the people who had been in the crowd to see what they had seen, or interview the disciples. And so it was just really fun, creative. I mean, they were making most of it up, but it really helped them create and do something that was entertaining and fun to watch, but it also made them think about the class in more of these I wonder questions and I think questions, and they really act them out. Another group went and they were given the task of writing a song. They had 10 minutes. They did a rap song that you could have recorded. They had dancers, they had the whole thing in 10 minutes, and it was absolutely a riot for them. But it was so good. I wish I had a recording of it. It was so good. Another group did artwork. So they took Play-Doh and clay and construction paper, and they did a diorama of the scene like that. So these are different things. The news reporter has been fun. Poems have been fun. Music's been fun. Art and pantomime are some of the ones. There's other ones. I think, John, some of the cultures you usually have used dance to tell the story. But these are the creative group activities that are really fun for people if you can get them up moving, and they really enjoy it. Again, you need a little more time. You need a group that'll do it, but it works. And you can't give them too much time. That's the principle. You give them a time crunch and they'll be more creative. than if you give them a long time to do it. All right, so those are some of the options that I have. But what I want you to do now is write down by E what is the explore option that you would like to use for your group that you've designated. So go ahead and write that down. And you can write down more than one if you aren't sure. Just what do you think would work with your group is what I want you to think about. And let's go on to summary now, because really you're done. You've got a lesson that you can expand and you can do a lot more with, but you want to think about how you're going to do the summary. Now here's the principles involved with the summary. Have your own summary ready of what you wanted to get across because you wrote the purpose, but don't be too quick to use it, because just like you've learned something from preparing this lesson that you want to share, they have something they learned, they're ready to share it with you. So what I like to do is really pull the summaries from the group. Now I'll have mine ready if nobody wants to talk, or if I have time, I'll give mine just because I like to hear myself talk. And I want people to hear what I got out of the story too. But I really want to hear what everybody else has gotten out of the lesson. And you'll find that they saw things you never saw. It's just awesome. I have one other summary activity that I think that I learned from Chuck Broughton and I really like is ask what kind of person would find this story helpful. What happens is it changes the lesson from something that they're getting for themselves to something that they can bless somebody else with. They start thinking of other people. I really like this one. John, Roger, you had something?
There's a private question in the chat room that I think is a pretty important one. How do you know when to give the application or the meaning of the story, the lesson of the story? Kind of what you were just talking about. You have a summary and some points you want to convey. Or how do you know when to allow the audience to let the Spirit work with them and draw their own lessons?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think our assumption as teachers is that they need to come to the conclusion that we came to sometimes, or that the application has to be discovered immediately. And I don't think either one are true. I think that the advantage of stories in the Bible is they take time. And look, Jesus would walk away from delivering a story, and people didn't even know what he was talking about. They had to stew on it for ages before they got it. There's great patience in narrative teaching. So that's part of the reason I say don't be too quick to use it. It's not bad to use your summary or give your application, but if somebody has self-discovery is the key. If they can discover it on their own, it'll stick. Whereas if you give an interesting point that they're like, that's a good point, it's not going to stick with them the same as if they discovered them themselves. So you're really looking for self-discovery and self-application, and that really is the work of the Spirit right there. So it's not wrong, but I would just lean towards active learning and self-discovery. Okay, so we've gone through, with using a rough sketch, move a narrative passage from the page to our mind to the room around us so that we can see it and discuss it and think about it. And we've kind of organized different levels of lesson from very short to medium to this longer version of things. And you should have something written by your purpose, your opening, your story presentation, your exploration of the story, and your summary that you can choose and use among that. And here's the nice thing that I like about narrative teaching is it has, with this process, it gives you such flexibility. So I could go out tomorrow and I could teach this in 3 minutes, or I could do a large group in an hour, or I could preach a sermon on it just by going through all these things. and I can expand and contract time-wise, and I can focus on a different audience, and it gives me great flexibility. So this is what I like about narrative teaching, and it really does work with this. So this is the raw material of your brainstorming that you have that fits for your group. And then finally, what I do is I review all these options that you have. And I consider the audience and choose the elements that are best for the group. You've kind of been doing that all along. And then I evaluate my time frame and I say, gosh, I love all these ideas, but it's going to take me an hour and a half to do this, and I only got 20 minutes. So you may have the best opening in the world, but if your opening takes 20 minutes, then you don't have the time to do it. And a lot of those, when I teach longer classes, I've found that the personal story opening takes 20 minutes. It really does. By the time you can get everybody quiet down and stop sharing about the storms they were in, you're at 20 minutes. And so you really have to evaluate your time frame and be really careful not to crowd the lesson. So this is John's phrase: take your lesson, cut the material in half, then cut it in half again. And that's exactly what I did in this lesson today. Is I had probably about 4 hours of lesson here, but we're down to this, and I'm still pushing the hour and a half. And so those are the principles. So start with the minimum of what is most important. Also look and say, what is it, if time does get short, what is it that I don't want to leave out? And I think it's going to be your presentation of the story and some core part of your exploration. So make sure you know what it is you don't want to lose. And you don't, because I've made this mistake where I've spent so much time on the opening, it was so much fun, I never got to what I wanted to do long enough to make the point that I wanted. So to be careful about that, because the opening can suck the life out of it can give life to your teaching session, it can suck it out. Roger.
A question from the chat. How do you keep people from going to an analysis before really seeing the story and making a number of observations?
Well, that's a good question. And that's why I say I really put my emphasis on the presentation of the story to make sure that they have that. Because when I'm presenting the story, they're not moving to analysis. So I feel like they have that. Then after that, I don't mind if they're eager to get to analysis. Like I said, I say sometimes just, well, does anybody have any questions? And we're off to the races. If I got a chatty group, I might not have to do any of the things I've prepared. They may take it and run. There's sometimes where people, you know who they are in your class, they're going to derail your class and take it somewhere you don't want to go. And you got to have a way to summarize them. And I learned this in my training for medical school. I just ask them a quick question, get them to stop talking, and then I say, that's a great point, but let's move on here. So you have to have a strategy for not letting people derail your class. But I think that most of the time, analysis by the class is what I'm welcoming. And so I don't have to worry about that so much. Good question. Okay, so finally, remember that this literature has endured because it is God's story. What I've talked to you is about educational techniques, but there's a reason we're applying it to biblical literature. And the story can stand on its own. I don't want to minimize the importance of good teaching techniques, but I want to tell you the story can stand on its own. It's good literature, it's God's word, and you want to really not put too much, you want to have a wise balance of how you're presenting to make sure that the focus is on what God is doing here. And that just takes time and thought. So what I do want you to do is go back on the things that you've done and think about your time frame you're going to have. You want to do that now, but then circle the things you definitely want to have in your story twice, the things you want to use once, and maybe cross out things that you're not going to use because of time or because of the group. But that's the basic narrative teaching Bible lesson that I wanted to share with you today. Now, let me just give you your homework, because I want you to try it out again on the story that I printed on the demon-possessed man story. But I'd like you to take this story this week and practice what we've done. I want you to take and first read and summarize the passage, but then break it into scenes. Use the lines and then picturize the story. Draw the scene out so that you can move it into your mind, so that you can have a movie and you can see this in your mind, and then move it out in the room. So really do that step for this demon-possessed man's story. And when you're done, you should have that in your mind. And then I want you to draw the narrative arc that we did before. You'll have the demon-possessed man story here. Draw your arc, identify your key points, think about the key points of the story and circle those, and consider all the perspectives of the people in that story. So go through that and then walk through this, write your poses at the one side, and just brainstorm options for presenting this next story in the series. And so take some time and do that this week.
Mark, do you have the scripture reference for the demon-possessed man handy there?
I do. It's I use Mark 5, 1 through 20. Okay, that is everything I wanted to present to you, and I really appreciate your participation, your willingness to do those things. I will be glad to stick around for questions, or again, be available for questions offline or email, or however you want to do that. Go ahead, Roger.
We've got a request to see the slide with the homework on it again. If you could back up a slide or two.
Yeah.
And while you're doing that, I'll remind everyone that you'll be receiving an email in 2 minutes with a link to an evaluation form, very simple, anonymous evaluation form for this workshop, and supporting materials, a summary of all the notes that Mark has given us today, and links to Phyllis's book and Phyllis's workshops coming up in August that Mark referred to in the class today.
And this slide is kind of a summary of the first session that I did. So the handout from the first session is how to do the homework as well. So you can take the handouts from both sessions and work those through then with the next story. And I think that's what you really want to do. I think if you don't work it through with the next story, your capture of the material is going to be less. So I really encourage you to do that if you at all can. Okay, if we have no other questions, thank you, everybody. I enjoyed sharing with you, and I hope it was helpful for you in your journey.